Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So today we are going to talk about Bible translations, Bible versions, what you should know. There's certainly a selection out there. Before we go forward, please hit either like or subscribe. Though I don't monetize my channel, it certainly helps it. And so I guess that's a big advantage. I'm no YouTube expert, but either way, we're going to get into Bible versions. And I apologize that there was no video last week. Had COVID last week. I was under the weather a bit, so I didn't have a voice to record, but we're back now. So as we move forward in this, I want to let you know, I'm not getting paid to endorse any particular Bible version or any of that type of stuff. My goal here is, if you are new to understanding how they actually create different versions, you'll get a good perspective on it here. I'm going to help you understand why there are so many different versions and everything else. So it really is what you should know if you're a Christian. So this is actually part of a number of videos that I do, on the structure of the Bible, the nature of inspiration, principles of canonization, manuscripts, which we'll get into a little bit today to help explain some stuff. But today it's Bible translations. There are two main principles that I'll give you a very short overview of that'll help you understand why there are different types of translations. So as we get into this, there are two major approaches. The first one is dynamic equivalence, or what they call functional equivalence. In other words, it is how the version that you're reading will function in reference to you. And then there's formal equivalence, or these versions are more literal, trying to adhere to the text of the New Testament, and so and Old Testament. But we'll concentrate on the New Testament because that's really the biggest issue when we get to versions. The changes really that occur in the New Testament. So to give a good overview, let's look at what the difference is. For example, the essence of equivalence. What that means is that under the functional side, when the translator translate from Greek into English, they are going to really reduce down the sentences into more of a thought-for-thought translation, where the literal is more of a sentence for sentence as much as possible. For the most part, it's impossible to bring one language to another always word for word, because either A, you couldn't read it because the sentences wouldn't make sense, and many of you that know foreign languages understand this, even going from other languages into English and vice versa, or there's just simply different words to express different ideas. So sometimes there is no equivalent word. For example, in Greek, you have 5 words for love. In English, you have one, love. I love my wife. I love ice cream. But they're obviously very different kinds of loves. But in Greek, they can separate them by different words. So it becomes very important to understand all this. The proper setting for each is different. Functional type versions are concerned with the language of the person reading, the receptor language. So in our case, it would be English. So it is what it's going to say in English. When you have a literal version, the translators are more concerned with the original language. In other words, whoever the New Testament writers were, what they said. So you're either going to cater to the reader or you're going to cater to the writer. And that's really the bottom line. The interpretation. Now, as far as the dynamic equivalence, it's a thematic interpretation, meaning they're going to try to interpret as much as possible in the sense that, and we're really talking on this side more around paraphrases, okay? But what they try to do in a paraphrase is they try to basically put the sentence, the verse, into their own words, which means they're going to have to do some translating beyond just, what the words mean, and you're getting into interpretation. In other words, this is what I think the verse means, and that's what I'm going to put into this translation or this version. And when you're doing formal equivalence, in other words, more of a literal view, what you're doing is you're dealing with the linguistic interpretation. You want to interpret the words, but you don't want to interpret the themes. In other words, you're not getting into what the writer you think is trying to communicate in theme. You're only interpreting the words and not the message, okay? That's really what the difference is. Form and content, right? So the translators that do paraphrases, they see them as separate dualities. In other words, they see the form of the writing different than the content. In other words, what is being the sentence structure and words used, they see that as different than the actual message. Where in the literal approach, they see it as the same thing. They're using actual literal words in a sentence structure because they are trying to communicate something. That is the content. In other words, they don't try to divide the two. They see it as the same whole. Meaning and words, right? So on the dynamic side, the meaning is expressed without words, right? A thought is known apart from words. So their view is that you can have thoughts that are not really expressed in the words. I don't really get that, but in the formal side, there is no meaning expressed without words, right? Because thoughts are known by the words that you use. That's how we communicate. So they definitely have a different perspective when they're getting into dynamic equivalence, or what we would call a paraphrase. You're putting the phraseology alongside of what it actually says, para, in your own words. Really, that's what they're doing here at that point. So how about the locus of the meaning? The locus is the source. Well, they see the source of the meaning in the mind of the reader, okay? When the person reads the Bible, they see and they understand the person that's reading is creating the meaning based on how they perceive it. When the formal equivalence side, when they do their translating, they are concerned only about the text because they believe the source of the meaning resides in the text, not in the person reading it. In other words, the author had something they wanted to say, and they're going to try to keep the words as much as possible, as literal as possible, yet, trying to work into it, because of the change in language, some kind of, literacy to it, in the sense that it's literary, okay? So it has to flow, and it has to have enough of a cadence so that it's not blocky and disjointed and difficult to read and follow. Under the dynamic side, they're trying to match ideas only. They're trying to basically grab concepts that they think the writer is dealing with. That's why they're not as concerned about the literal words. in the formal side, ideas and words and word classes. In other words, it's very specific to the words because of how the words are used by the original writer. So they're taking into account on the formal side all the grammar, the word definitions, as well as how it's arranged grammatically. All those become very important to try to keep it as close to the original as possible. The meaning and significance, right? They think translations can do both. They can give you meaning and significance, where on the formal side, the translation only can give you meaning. It can't create the significance through reading it. In other words, the paraphrase side, what they're trying to do is they're trying to enhance the translation in their own words to try to make it significant to the person reading. Well, that's adding a lot in by the translator that really shouldn't be there, because all you can give them is the meaning of the words and the meaning of the sentences. You can't get into interpretation, that kind of meaning. The goal in the dynamic side is to reproduce the same effect, right? So the effect that would be had by the reader, in other words, what they think originally a reader would have as they read it, they're going to try to reproduce that in the modern reader, where all they can do on the literal or the formal side is reproduce the same meaning of the text. You can't create an effect. This isn't, cinematic, movie making where you have sounds and video to try to create this effect. But that's what they're trying to do in words to engage the reader. The goal is not to engage the reader. The goal really is to make sure that the same meaning is reproduced in the text as opposed to what's felt in the reader. The focus is on the formal, on the dynamic side, is the response to the message. And again, see, these all go together. That they're trying to cater to the reader's mind and somehow motivate them and excite them and draw them in, almost like a storybook. And so they're concerned about the response of the reader, where on the formal side, it's the form of the message. I think you can see where we're going with this. When you're trying to, when you have in these two different approaches, which are much different, you can understand now why some Bible versions are very literal, and then other ones are just very loosely paraphrased in people's own words, because they're not concerned about what the original author wrote down. The translations that would fall into these, the NIV in certain areas would be dynamic equivalents. Not all the NIV. I mean, some of it is really translated well, and there are many parts of it that are really just kind of paraphrases, thought for thought. And but on the formal side, you have the King James, New King James, New American Standard, and ESV. It would be really kind of the four major versions that are out there today that would match that. So reasons against the dynamic equivalent or the paraphrases. So let's talk about those for a minute. Paraphrases wrongly tries to translate significance, like we had talked about. In other words, how it applies, and not just the meaning, what it means. They're trying to get into application because they're actually interpreting it almost like a commentary. That's now, some people enjoy that because they don't want to go dig into a commentary or look up words or do any kind of study. They just want they want to try to get the whole thing out of just reading it like a storybook. But the Bible is really designed to be studied. It's not just designed to be read like a storybook or a novel. Actually, it's that problem within the culture that has catered to this creation of so many different paraphrases to try to accommodate readers, and that's why they make these versions that are paraphrases, because people, they're afraid people won't read the Bible unless they may make it so attractive and so engaging and all that. But I think that they're short-sighting the Holy Spirit on that. Second thing is, it makes interpretive decision for the reader and runs the risk of being wrong. Like we're talking about, it becomes like a commentary. Well, commentaries can be wrong. I mean, you read a commentary on different parts of the Bible, and depending upon their theological perspective, they are going to have a different interpretation. And unfortunately, you have a person that creates a paraphrase. I mean, if I made my own paraphrase, I'm going to create that paraphrase with the theological perspective that I have. I'm certainly not going to use somebody else's. So when it gets to a place where, it can kind of go either way, well, it's going to go my way. I could be wrong on that. So the person that reads it, I'm not only accountable for them reading what could be wrong, but they are going to get a misunderstanding of the Bible because of that. It wrongly requires translators to resolve ambiguities for the readers. Now this is part of the problem of paraphrases, is they want to make it so that every single verse is easily understandable and means something. But the problem is there are verses that are ambiguous. They're ambiguous because obviously God wanted them to be ambiguous. The Holy Spirit, when he was moving the writers to write, wanted them to write what they said. And if it's ambiguous, he wants it like that. And we maybe have to dig out as to why, or it needs to remain a question. Not every single answer is going to come to us in our searching through the Bible as to, why a writer said one thing or another. Will we get, the majority of it? Yeah, of course. But sure, there are verses in question, and there are certain things that can kind of go either way. It's ambiguous, but that's what obviously the Holy Spirit wanted. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had them put down those words. Number 4, it wrongly assumes that form is simply a vehicle to get the content, in other words, the message, across to the recipient. The form is not just a vehicle to get the message across. The form is the message. In other words, the form creates the message. So you can't just kind of change words and alter the sentence and put it in your own words, and then you can create an entirely different message to the recipient. Okay, I think that those that do paraphrases don't have that respect for exactly what the Holy Spirit had these writers write down. It wrongly encourages the translators to interpret images and figures for the reader. Now, there's a lot of images and figures in the Bible, and there's parables, there's figurative sayings, there's metaphors, there's similes, there's a lot of things. Some of them explained well, some of them a little ambiguous, and the translators are kind of forced to explain those because they don't want the reader to not get exactly what they think the verse means. Again, we're back to the same problem of interpretive decisions. And it often leads to a loss of important repetitions and emphasis in the text. In other words, there are times when things are repeated in the original where paraphrases remove the repetition because it doesn't seem to communicate well. But yet, at the same time, it's repeated for a problem and for emphasis. That's why God has done it. 7, it wrongly assumes the meaning can be best understood in the context of the receptor language. Now, for us, that's English, right? And that's not true. The best understanding of the New Testament is if you could read Greek. Now, Most of us can't, so we have to read in our own language, right? Our receptor language is English. So, but the assumption that you can get the best meaning in English is incorrect, because there's a number of places in the New Testament where certain idioms and word emphasis and even word play can't really be reproduced in English. Now it can, if somebody is teaching that does their homework and looks up the Greek words and has a commentary, or grammarian like Vincent or Vines or A.T. Robertson or Alford or somebody like that. When you're looking up these guys that are experts in word definitions and grammar, well, you can get those idioms and explain it as you're teaching. But other than that, you're not going to get it. If you're just reading through the Bible, you will miss some of those features. It wrongly assumes that form and content are a separate duality. They're not. The form and the content, the message, in other words, how the sentence is structured, of course, it directly contributes to the message, because that's how you're understanding the message. You can't just kind of separate them apart as though they're two different things. It wrongly assumes that meaning can be known without words or other expressions. And again, I don't know how they come to a conclusion like this, because they're actually learning what the meaning is, even if they're going to make an interpretation based on the actual words. So for those of you who have followed me and you understand the law of non-contradiction, this would really violate the law of non-contradiction, because you're basically saying that I don't need words to understand, what the author is saying, yet at the same time I'm using the author's words to understand what the author is saying so that I can reword it, right? If you follow that. It wrongly assumes that the author's thought can be known without the text. Again, that's an absurdity. How can I know the author's thought? I actually can't necessarily know the author's thought unless the author tells me. I can only know the text and try to interpret it in its context. That's all I can know, right? And that's how I derive the meaning. It wrongly assumes that the locus, or the source of meaning, is in the author's mind rather than in the text. Well, if it's in the author's mind, how am I going to figure that out if it's not in the text? Of course it has to be in the text. The author is writing the text. That's how you know what he means and what he's thinking. To as much as possible, your understanding of what an author is thinking is based on what he's writing. You can't, it's not like we have a crystal ball to look through to tell us what the author was thinking, though he wrote different words. None of that makes any sense. It wrongly assumes its goal is to reproduce the same effect rather than the same meaning. Obviously, you can't produce an effect in a reader that you think that the reader is supposed to have. You can only give the reader the meaning, and whatever the effect is going to be the effect. And it wrongly focuses on the response to the message rather than on the form of the message. Paraphrases, the people that do them are overly concerned with how the person's going to respond. Again, it's like these movie makers that are trying to create an effect by the cinematic, sound and visual and all that. And, that's not the method for Bible translations. This is in Hollywood, right? Doesn't work like that. The goal of a Bible translation is to faithfully reproduce in another language what the author said in Greek when we're talking about the New Testament. Now, accepted rules now this is for all published texts, okay? the author's own words matter. Look, I wrote 2 books, right? And in both books, the words that I chose were specifically chose by me to communicate what I was thinking and what I want to convey. If somebody reads my book and says, oh, Mitchell meant this, when that's not what I meant, it doesn't matter what it means to them. What matters is what I meant when I wrote it, right? Because when people write their books, even the people that want to promote this perspective on the dynamic equivalence side, where it's really in the reader's mind that, that's where the meaning has reference to and all this stuff. No, that's not true, because if you go to any of those people's books and you read them and you say, well, this is what it means, and if it's different from what they wrote, they'll correct you. Because when they wrote that down as the author, they knew what they were trying to convey. And if you change the meaning and say, well, this is what it means to me, they say, well, that may be what it meant to you, but that's not what I wrote. And that's not what I said or why I said it. So, that sword cuts both ways. Publishers and editors are not ordinarily allowed to change the words of literary texts. Again, the woman that did the editing on my books, when she got to a place where she felt like the sentence was not clear, she'd ask, she would make a suggestion, but she would even say sometimes, I'm not sure exactly what you're trying to say. So I think this is what you're trying to say, but I don't want to change it because I don't want to change what you're trying to communicate. Can you reword the sentence? Hopefully I got all those, but, that's what editors do, Readers expect to receive the actual words of an author. Exactly. Because otherwise why read the book? Readers need to be educated in the meaning of difficult texts. Now, even in the books that I published, there are certain words or phrases that, I had to footnote and explain, because I know that there are a lot of Christians that may not be familiar with certain word definitions. Maybe they don't get into some aspects of theology where they'd be familiar to them. So, I would explain them. But if they are uninterested in looking at the footnotes to learn maybe what a word means or whatever, or if they are uninterested in reading some of the sentences that they may feel are too difficult because they don't want to learn what the words are, then they won't get the meaning out of it. Figurative language is not changed, but is explained in notes. And again, that's really true with many published texts, where if somebody is using figurative language for something, the explanation is given in notes. Authors expect their own words to be unaltered by publishers. I mean, certainly, I had to read back through my books after they were edited to make sure that they were still saying what I wanted them to say. If certain things were changed, even punctuation can change something. And this is really, this is actually from this book. I don't know if you can see it, the Word of God in English, right? This is actually a good book. If you're interested, it kind of goes into this in depth. And, this was taken from page 30. So why shouldn't we treat the Bible in the same way? We should. Our understanding of the fundamentals of reading and comprehension do not change when we get to the Bible. What does change is the message becomes clarified when we have the Holy Spirit because he's our teacher. Okay, but that doesn't mean that because he's our teacher that we still don't have to look up words, read commentaries, get some history and background and stuff like that, because you don't just automatically know it. You got to do a little digging sometimes. How about the criteria of a good translation? Let's look at that. It's accurate, clear, right? Vivid, right? You talk about like selecting on a television vivid where the colors are bright and everything. Well, you want to have a vivid translation. You want to have something that is not just clear but stands out in the use of words and all that when they're translated into the other language. It's orthodox. In other words, orthodox means right. Unorthodox means wrong. In other words, it doesn't have anything in there that would give an implication of false teaching, something unbiblical. It preserves ambiguities of the original. If the original has ambiguities, the translation should have ambiguities, right? I find it interesting that, baptism in the New Testament, that word is not translated. It is transliterated. And the difference is, when you translate it into English from Greek, you anglicize the word. So it goes from the Greek word of, baptizo to baptism, right? If you were going to, if you were transliterating it, you're just going from baptizo to baptism. If you're translating it, you can translate the meaning, and then that would give you maybe identification, because baptism was really, it has to do with dunking something in. The garment dyers would take a garment and put it into a color, right? They would baptize it in. So you get this white garment and you put it into this red dye. Well, when you pull up that white garment, it's now red because the garment now becomes identified with the color of the dye, right? So baptism is an identification process. Yes, do you get wet as the ritual makes you wet. You go underwater. However, the meaning of baptism, in other words, its significance, is identification, which is why, like when you get to 1 Corinthians 10, it says, they're all baptized into Moses in the Red Sea. Well, first of all, they went across on dry ground. So they certainly weren't baptized in water. How were they baptized into Moses? Nobody got dunked into him. They were identified with him, right? You were baptized into Jesus' death, right? Romans 6. Well, you were identified with his death. So baptism really, whether it's the ritual or it's just talking about the act of faith when you came to Christ, there's an identification process, which is why John the Baptist's baptism was different. He had a baptism of repentance. So his baptism identified people with repentance in preparation for the Messiah, which is different. Anyways, a good translation is transparent to the original. In other words, if you could read Greek and then you could read English, you could see that there's a transparency. There's nothing that's different, right? It expects the best from its readers, that the readers will put in effort. It retains the poetic form of the original. If the original has some aspect of poetic form, then it keeps that. It doesn't change it, doesn't interpret it. It has beauty and dignity. In other words, it has a literary cadence to it, and it's not, choppy and kind of like a hacked translation to keep it real literal. And again, this is taken from the conclusion section of Ryken's book that I just showed you. A lot of these are kind of broken out actually into chapters. Now, we're going to get a little bit into the deeper end of the pool here. Why do some translations exclude certain verses? I get that question all the time. And this is going to be the answer. There are three main manuscript families, or what we call text types. We're talking about the Greek manuscript copies that make up the New Testament, that that are in existence, that are used to make translations. Okay, so Bible translations are based on one of these three manuscript families or text types, and I'll show you what that means in a minute, or a combination of them. The three families are first the Byzantine family text type, which tends to have it like the verses. If there's a shorter and longer reading on a verse, typically it will be the longer reading. There's what they call the critical text, which is typically shorter readings. So some verses seem to have a few words shorter. That would represent the critical text typically. And the Textus Receptus, which I'll explain what that is, which again is typically longer readings. So let's take a look. This is a manuscript overview, and these are screenshots from a presentation that you might want to actually watch. I think they did a good job, but it's from Corner Talker, that YouTube channel. Don't know really anything about who the person is. I went through the presentation, and as far as this is concerned, I think they did a good job, at least in representing the manuscripts and how they are arranged. So as you can see in the upper right, those are called Alexandrian texts. Those are really what fall into the category of critical texts. The Byzantine texts are on the left. They are the majority. And then there are some selected others. Notice that the Western text there in the red circle, that is Codex Bezae. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that and Codex Alexandrinus, which kind of hovers between the Alexandrian text and the Byzantine text, those two are added to the Alexandrian text and are usually included with them by those that utilize what they call the critical text. Okay? The other codexes that are kind of hanging out there are in the minor. They're certainly looked at, but they don't kind of fall into any real category in a sense. So the Byzantine text, let's look at that first. It's typically called the majority text because it's representing the majority of extant or existing manuscripts. There's over 5,000 of them. The majority of them are between really the 4th and 10th century. They are later manuscripts, okay? And it does not pose a problem that they are later because they have readings that are referenced earlier, and they obviously are existing, and the earlier ones are not, because the earlier ones were lost or destroyed through use or time, right? That's just kind of how it is. These manuscripts were given to the entire church in the largest geography. They spread throughout the whole Byzantine Empire, as opposed to the critical text in one smaller geography. We'll get into that. They followed really the layout of these manuscripts. In other words, the Byzantine Empire, they follow Paul's missionary journey travels. So whatever Paul had and whatever was distributed to the churches after Paul had gone on his missionary journeys, what they had in New Testament writings and everything else were distributed out throughout the regions of Paul's missionary journey, which is really represented in these majority text manuscripts. Using these manuscripts takes readings that are existing, in other words, that exist today, and are represented in the majority of manuscripts. So and we'll get into this in a minute, but the way they figure out what the majority text is, because you can't go into over 5,000 manuscripts to make a translation. It's not possible, right? You can't even do it really with, a half a dozen or a dozen. What you have to do is you have to somehow take all that you have and put it into a text. In other words, you're basically taking the readings that you want to make a Greek, and it's not a translation, it's a text. So with the majority, what they do is they go through and they take out of all the existing manuscripts, the majority reading. In other words, what does it say in the majority verses in regard to, and we're not talking major changes. We're talking, maybe some sentence structure, spelling, like they have orthographical errors in many manuscripts and things like that, which I get into in the New Testament reliability presentation. But the variances are not they're not changing the meaning. They're just getting exactly the words and the grammatical structure as it's written in the majority of manuscripts. That's what they're taking. And if there isn't a majority for some reason, we'll get into the other criteria that they select from. Now, the New King James best represents the majority text and the Textus Receptus. And the New King James is good because it provides notes in the margin from existing manuscripts that help with if there's a variant reading. So if you have a New King James and you're reading through some area and there's a little note and you go down and it says, I don't know, in the LXX it's translated this way, or it says this. The LXX is the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it'll say the critical text, usually the NU text is the critical text, the Nestle-Aland text, but NU has this, and what that means is that in the critical text, this is how they have it translated, as opposed to in the majority text. You find that there's, nothing's going to actually change the meaning for the most part, especially in any area of doctrine or anything. It's just not going to happen. But this is where the exacting comes in. So this is how they make their decisions, the criteria. There's a ranking for decisions within the majority. So if you're dealing with over 5,000 manuscripts, the majority reading, in other words, within a sentence or whatever verse, is considered the authentic one. It's very simple, right? If for some reason there's not a majority, if there was a 50-50 split or there was just multiple combinations, antiquity is invoked, if necessary, to the next priority. In other words, you'd say, okay, out of all these, since there's no real majority, what's the oldest one? Take the one that's oldest, assuming that it is probably closer to the original. Not always, but that would be the next step. If you couldn't do that, the quality of ubiquity, in other words, it's present across a wide distribution. So basically, if you had a 50-50 split, and they were all within the same dating time, then you'd say, okay, which one is spread over a wider distribution geographically? Ubiquity means just how it permeates all of them in the distribution. But The fourth thing would be versional support in other languages. So you'd look at other languages that translate it, Latin, Nubian, Coptic, Syrian, you go through all these different languages, say, okay, how did they translate it? Since we can't really find a legitimate majority and everything else, and they're all the same age, they're all in the same geographic area. Well, how about in the versional support? Those that translated it to other languages in different areas, how did they translate it? In other words, what sentence structure or word, if there was a word choice, did they use? If that couldn't help you, then you'd go to the patristic evidence, which is the early church fathers, and that's representation outside of actual manuscripts. In other words, the early church fathers, the first couple of centuries, they would, they had their Bible lessons and they wrote their, papers on commentaries and everything else, and they would quote verses. Well, how did they quote them? That would play into it. And then the last one would be internal evidence. In other words, you'd look at word usage from a writer. Does this writer typically use that word or not? This is not a great way to do it, but when you get down to the sixth level, you're invoking other means. But that's how they would select it, and I think it's a good process. Now, among the Alexandrian manuscripts, the two main ones that they use, Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are the two earlier ones, and they like those because they're the fuller manuscripts. They have a lot of disagreements. In other words, just those two manuscripts here shows you the number of disagreements just between the Gospels, right? So it's not like they have two manuscripts in Alexandria, Egypt, which is why they're called Alexandrian manuscripts, that are exactly like each other, and then, we got the rest of all the other over 5,000 that are not, okay? Just so we're on the same page. So the critical text type, let's look at that. Mainly it's based on four manuscripts, the ones that I circled in that one, right? Codex Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Beze. And they are all, for the most part, around 4th to 5th century manuscripts. Those are the list right there. Beze is really 5th to 6th century, and doesn't really have much agreement with, it's called a Western text type because it's different and they don't know how else to classify it and where they found it in the West. So it doesn't have a lot of agreement. And again, it's not teaching anything different. I don't want you to think when we're talking about disagreement that the disagreement is, when we're talking about disagreement, the sentence is not exactly the same in structure in many places, as well as maybe there's a different word used to translate. But it's not like it's teaching a different doctrine or anything. This is my biggest complaint with these. There are readings in few other partial manuscripts that are similar to these manuscript readings. In other words, note these manuscripts disagree with each other, but they can have, like when they create their Greek text to translate from, they have in their Greek text verses that have no manuscript representation. In other words, they're kind of guessing at what they thought a scribe may have meant or whatever, and they end up with the text that they translate the English version with, basically a text that is unrepresentative in any particular manuscript. Sometimes it's just kind of a blend of a couple of Alexandrian manuscripts together, but it's not one or the other, which is interesting. It's not really. I mean, you're what you're saying is I think that they probably should have. We should make the text say this, even though we have no representation anywhere, for various reasons. They think it makes more sense. They think that's what the author was trying to convey and all this. And I just think it's I think you're going down the wrong road. That's the nicest way to say it. So the value of these manuscripts are really the age and the fact that they have most of the New Testament in each one, as opposed to, with the majority text, you'll have the Gospels together in one, you'll have Paul's epistles in another, or Peter's, or, some combination of epistles and maybe a gospel or whatever, or sometimes just one book of the New Testament. So it's not like you're comparing 5,000 complete like New Testaments. Sometimes you only have, fragments. What's interesting is the book of Revelation has to be taken really from, for the most part, the majority text, because there's not enough representation in the earlier ones. Quite interesting, I thought. Most Bible translations from the critical text, most of the Bible translations today are from the critical text, except the King James and New King James and any others that would claim to be like a majority text translation. Okay? So as we look at the geographies, this is really the ancient Byzantine Empire, and you can see this is where, Paul had his missionary journeys. This is the spread of where he established churches and all that. This is the Alexandrian area for the critical text. It's a it's smaller than that square. It's a very, very small area. It's just Alexandria, Egypt. That's where they found these manuscripts. So this gives you some idea. Now, in this shows you kind of the flow of the two manuscript results. In other words, how did we get the majority text? If you look on the far right, you see that, that's really representative of the majority text. Now, there are some earlier texts that are part of that, the Byzantine text and majority text, but notice they work their way back into the 500s, but yet the Alexandrian texts are for the most part earlier, okay? And that's why the scholars like those few. But that's why they're also only a couple, but they're really isolated if you look at it like that. You're really ignoring the majority of manuscripts to just translate from the Alexandrian texts. Now, how about anything earlier than that? Now, the Byzantine text type is representative in Hippolytus, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Tatian. So these are early church fathers. There are some manuscript representations that really kind of align with the Alexandrian manuscripts and some of the other codexes, but and they're very early. However, you don't have the largest representation there. There's just very little, but it does show that there are some earlier readings. But that does not necessarily mean accurate. So we know that that to be true. That is an oversimplification. This whole presentation is an oversimplification of textual criticism, but it's an oversimplification to just assume that if it's earlier, it's better, because there's some things that are earlier that are obviously worse and represent nothing. So this would be the early church fathers. This would be early papyrus that, and you can see how they relate in that way. Now, the Latin Vulgate played a big role in this. Jerome in the late 300s, he made use of both when he translated his Latin. So that's interesting because he had kind of information from both, and he utilized it in his Vulgate. And how about the Textus Receptus, right? The received text, it's called, and it's based on 8 to 12 manuscripts that were extant in the 15th century. We don't have all of them necessarily today. It was used by Desiderius Erasmus to compile the Textus Receptus, based mostly on manuscripts that are closest to the Byzantine text, with the use of Jerome's Latin Vulgate of the 4th century. So basically, the Vulgate was used when creating the Textus Receptus. Now, how did it get that name? Well, the name Textus Receptus was first used in the preface of the 1624 edition, Greek text, produced by the Dutch Elsevier brothers. And what it said at the front, and they printed it off in their printing, the text now received by all, in which we give nothing changed or corrupted. But this is where the name, the designation comes from. When they said the text now received, then in Latin it's Textus Receptus, in English it's received text. So this is really what the King James was translated from. That's why if you ever get into these conversations and all, and people start talking about the Textus Receptus, the King James and all that, well, this is where it all comes from. And the King James represents the Textus Receptus, as does the New King James, with help from the majority text. So the New King James really was an update to the King James, taking into account the Textus Receptus and trying to stay as true to that as possible. However, with the addition of many more manuscripts that have been found and classified, then they also use that. The general editor of the New King James, Arthur Farstead, who has gone to be with the Lord, he actually was a majority text guy. So he utilized, he stayed true to the, Textus Receptus as much as possible, put in many footnotes for the majority text and others. So I think it ended up being a great translation. So this is kind of how it worked out for translations. So on the left, you can see, we'll back that off for a second. On the left, you can see Erasmus. He was the one that actually put the Greek text together that, they ended up really using for the Textus Receptus. And he used the Byzantine texts and the Latin Vulgate of Jerome and everything else. On the right, in the 1881 Revised Version, Westcott and Hort, they introduced the Alexandrian text at that point. Now, the problem is that they were supposed to make a new King James. Basically, in 1881, Westcott and Hort did not like the Textus Receptus, or the majority text. They liked the Alexandrian text, so that's what they went with. And you can see that the results basically are, all the modern Bibles really come from the Alexandrian texts today. So, why is the majority text preferred? And I got to really move on this. Over, well, you know what? It's an hour. I'm going to go through, and I just don't have the time right now, and I don't want to push it. It's at 59 minutes, so we'll go through why the majority text is preferred. There's a number of reasons. It has to be a part 2, so I apologize. I thought I'd get through it all today, but anyways, this is where we're going on it. So hopefully this is of value to you so far, kind of getting up under the covers a little bit, opening up the hood to see what's in this this vehicle, in a sense, to look at how translations have been done and, where they're based and everything else. Again, if you have any questions, just let me know at BibleMadeClear@gmail.com. But until next week, when we do part 2, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.